a liberal democracy separates Latino families and puts their babies, their children, and adolescents in prison. Unfortunately, cruel anti-immigrant policies are not only occurring in Trump's United States. Xenophobic policies are also being applied in Western Europe, India, and anti-immigrant feelings are rising in South American nations, especially against Venezuelan refugees. What is happening now with the surge of refugees reminds me of the creation of stateless people in Europe after the First World War. When populations did not have a state to protect them, they could become victims of human rights abuses and even genocide. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, who was a Jewish woman, was stripped of her German nationality, argues that statelessness is a precondition for totalitarianism. This conference illustrates how I see the role for a Center of Latin American Studies. First, I want to show the value of interdisciplinary work. Today we will listen to experts in ethnic studies, history of the Holocaust, political theory, and theology, offering different and complementary perspectives. Second, a Center for Latin American Studies has to pay attention to pressing social and political issues, such as the dehumanization of people of color worldwide. Finally, Latin American Studies has always been in dialogue with other world regions, and with different academic perspectives. Today we will learn what is new about policies and discourses that dehumanize Latinos in comparative and interdisciplinary perspectives. This event is possible thanks to the contribution of the Program of Gender and Women Studies, the Office of Diversity, and the hard work of Patricia Alba, Maggie Martinez, and other people at the staff of the Center for Latin American Studies. So welcome here, and I will introduce each speaker at a time. So we will start today with Professor Susana Boler. She's Professor of Latin America and Latinx Studies at John Jay College at the City University of New York. Her current research and teaching is centered on human rights in the Americas, focusing on racism, immigration, citizenship, and national belonging. She's the author of a founding text on Latino studies entitled Ethnic Label of Latino Lives, and various articles and chapters. She's the editor of several books, and she's also the co-editor of 2 encyclopedias on Latinx in the United States. Most recently, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Latinos and Latinas in Comparative Politics, Laws, and Social Movement. She was the founding editor of the journal Latino Studies, and in 2011, she was named Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies at the PCU in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Susan, thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Carlos, for this invitation to this conference, which for me today it is nothing more important than what's going on in relation to the immigrants and refugees and the Latino population in the United States. And I also want to give a shout out to Maggie. There she is. Awesome. And all your work. Thank you so much for everything you did to make this possible for us to come here. So my talk is really about what happens when a group begins to lose the protection of their state, which is what I believe is beginning to happen to the Latinx population. And I want to begin with something that a sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman said. He reminded us, actually, that Ernest Gellner, very, very many years ago, emphasized this kind of counterintuitive idea. Nationalism creates nations, instead of the other way around. And yet, in the context of deeply transnational and movable boundaries shaken by globalization, even the once territorially grounded sense of national belonging stretches across nations. And so the result, Bauman suggests, is that the nation is no longer a social given. And so insofar as nationalism creates nations, it's imperative that we study nationalism as a sociopolitical phenomenon in order to see what kind of nation it's creating and how how it's being created and sustained by boundaries, in this case defined by ethnicity. In the US context, the boundaries were officially recreated, defined, imposed, however you want to call it, at the end of the 20th century by Directive 15 of the Office of Management and Budget in 1977. That is the directive that divided the US population into 5 racial and ethnic categories, one of which was Hispanic. It ultimately, Directive 15, created a hierarchical structure as the Clinton Race Task Force concluded in 1998. It's an edifice that is grounded in the belief in the superiority of whiteness and white prejudice and privilege in the US racial meritocracy. And that's the same kind of meritocracy and whiteness and white privilege that has underpinned the very foundations of this nation from its earliest days. Clearly, each group invariably had, by 1998, come to know its place in this society. Drawing from the now classic theories by Barth, Bauman also reminds us that it's not so much the substance contained within those boundaries, but also the maintenance of the boundaries themselves that are going to ensure the continuation of an ethnic group. And under these conditions, nationalism can become a social movement. Think, for instance, of the Republican Party and the Trumpist base in this context, whereby white supremacy defines the terms of belonging. So one of the most striking transformations of long-term impact bears on the meaning and the political parameters of citizenship in this new century. In my view, the Latinx experience of belonging in US society is a paradigm in this context, and it may serve as a presage for the global and today also domestic challenges to democracy that we have to find a new way of addressing. So it's interesting to note, for example, that 5 years after the Clinton Race Task Force, the Pew Foundation released an executive report of its own. This is post 9/11, which reinforced the conclusion of the task force, and it added the following statement. The Latino experience demonstrates that whiteness remains an important measure of belonging, stature, and acceptance. And Hispanic views of race also show that half of this ever-large segment of the US population is feeling left out. That was back in 2004. By 2012, feeling left out was an understatement. The Republican platform was insisting on tough border enforcement, and it opposed any form of amnesty for illegal immigrants, that's a quote, instead endorsing what amounted to a policy of self-deportation. The rhetoric, of course, has worsened substantially during the Trump administration. Last fall, a Puerto Rican journalist, Susan Ramirez de Arellano, explained that she was leaving in the United States, saying, "As a Latino, I no longer feel safe in Trump's America. If you speak Spanish or you look like me, America has become another name for hate. In Trump's America, to be Hispanic is to be an alien." So in this new context, it's important for us to ask, how do we best understand this hateful racism toward Latinx people? Is it just an exacerbated version of the traditional racism that Latinxes and African Americans and other people have experienced throughout this country's history? Is it strictly xenophobia, hatred of the other, or a form of racialized nativism? Or is it something else? Perhaps it's all the above in a more targeted form, one that certainly seems to be limited to one group, Mexicans, which is a term that I'm going to argue has become an umbrella term for Latinxes as a whole, now stripped of their concrete identity, regardless of legal status or even of the fact of citizenship. Along these lines, and without minimizing what's been happening to Muslims and other groups during the Trump presidency, my next question would be, how do we address the increasingly reprehensible and draconian criminal justice enforcement practices against primarily Latin American immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers on the southern border, or those against US Latinx citizens and green card holders across this country today. In addition to the obvious additional stress and fear sown in Latinx communities, what does it mean that Trump is now planning on sending elite tactical teams into sanctuary cities like New York or Chicago or Boston, among other cities, to help with immigration arrests? These teams have been described in the media as, quote, members of a unit that functions as the Border Patrol's SWAT team. They carry stun grenades and they receive special forces-like training, such as sniper certification, unquote. I ask these questions because ever since Trump came down the escalator to declare his presidency, in 2015, he has been making a point of specifically confronting what he seems to see as the Mexican scourge in this country. He said that day, and I think we have to remember all the time what he said, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing those problems with them. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. His targeting of Mexicans has since continually emphasized an invasion coming across the country's southern border, which Natalie Martinez pointed out. Trump roughly said 2,200 Facebook ads between 2018 and 2019. They all use the word invasion. They all seem to be about immigration. So the full intent of Trump's initial statements on Mexicans, I think, has now been pointedly captured by Tomás Sáenz, and it's what led me to write this paper this way. Tomás Sáenz is the director of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, or MALDEF. It's a very important and very old legal defense fund for the Chicanx organization. And last October 7th, about 2 months after the El Paso shooting, Sáenz put forward his assessment of the current state of affairs in this country. And I quote, "The discrimination is certainly more direct, more open than in my lifetime, and certainly emanates from the President of the United States," he said. And then he goes on, "Trump's policies and practices seem intent on eliminating the Latino community as an essential part of this country." At this point, I'm finding it hard to disagree with him. Denigrating Mexicans, as I'm sure everyone here knows or should know, didn't begin with Trump, despite his deliberate targeting of Mexicans from day one. But what's new is that the term Mexican has definitely now come to officially replace the label Hispanic or Latinx, and it also now seems to indiscriminately signify both citizens and non-citizens, both legal residents and immigrants, illegal aliens, refugees, in fact, anyone of Latin American descent. At the same time, this trend is being reinforced by the coming together of the federal prison system that cages the stranger within, and the over 200 federal detention centers that today operate to literally cage arriving asylum seekers and their families, or to deport them to be murdered, which is, according to a Human Rights Watch report just last week, what US authorities have knowingly been doing to Salvadorians between 2013 and 2017. And as we also know, in addition to separating families, limiting the number of people processed daily at ports of entry, prolonging detention, narrowing the grounds of eligibility for asylum, the now one-year-old migrant protection protocols, colloquially known as the Return to Mexico policy, is summarily returning primarily Central American asylum seekers back to Mexico, where they're being forced to live in highly precarious and dangerous camps with no access to due process, and with tens of thousands of them, including children and families, in harm's way. So let me now turn to a brief historical overview of how I think this targeting of Mexicans has come about historically, and then discuss its implications in the current Trump context. First of all, it's very important for everyone to know that the legitimate belonging of Mexican Americans in this country should never have been put in question, given that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the US war against Mexico in 1848 formally defined the terms of their naturalization and promised US citizenship to all social classes who were living on the conquered territories at that time. Nevertheless, the binary racial classifications of the time rendered all Mexicans into unwanted, and Mexicans I'm always using in quotes, into unwanted and therefore disposable people from the start, irrespective of the terms of citizenship. Such that by 1921, US Congressman James Slaton, for example, glibly explained, and I quote, "The word Mexican is used to indicate a race, not a citizen or a subject of the country." Moreover, in the 1920s, and again, regardless of citizenship status, historian David Montejano tells us that wages paid to Mexican laborers were so far below those of white workers that they were termed Mexican wages. And so, as the legal scholar Laura Gomez puts it, this history of entering the nation as a colonized people rather than as immigrants, and the history of the vast majority of the first Mexican Americans as second-class citizens living in a contiguous colony, have shaped the racialization of Mexican Americans. In fact, the term Mexican itself has been from the beginning indicative of the institutional and societal exclusion of people of Mexican descent. And yet, given the economic advantages of cheap labor, the geographical proximity to Mexico, Mexican migration has also long been economically motivated and encouraged by the United States. And so over 1.5 million immigrants crossed the border from Mexico between 1890 and 1930 alone. I think it's important to emphasize that there's always been debates about the extent of immigrant criminality and questionable rationalization for their presence. Like today, there were serious ideological differences related to economic interests between pro and anti-immigration groups. But what's important is to emphasize that then, as now, both nativist restrictionists and labor-hungry anti-restrictionists have always relied on the same racial prejudices and discriminatory practices in making their respective cases. The only thing that has really changed is the language, and on that, some of it only. So, for example, in the 20th century, early 20th century, Mexicans were described as mongrels and Indians, and both sides were convinced that it was impossible to affirm that the United States could mold the peon into a worthwhile citizen. And as US Congressman Slaton said, these people really could never become real citizens. These affirmations have always been accompanied by the criminalization of Mexican immigrants and further rationalized the constant threat of detention and deportation. In periods when there was no national crisis, you got what Natalia Molina defined as medicalized nativism. That was rooted in racist assumptions about the contagious diseases on the bodies and cultures of arriving immigrants. And so there was medical detention and quarantine along the US border from 1917 until the beginning of World War II. But the issue of illegality, which has dominated criminalization of immigrants and citizens to this day, actually really began in 1929 when there was a decision made to outlaw undocumented entry into the United States. David Hernandez tells us that ever since, whether through the application of the law or through popular culture, Latinos have lived in fear of being arbitrarily and summarily declared illegal, and hence criminals, which leads to arrests, detentions, and deportations, regardless of the outrage that Mexican American organizations constantly have expressed. These racist mentalities and practices ultimately led to the repatriation of hundreds of thousands of people of Mexican American descent, their families and children, back in the 1930s. Half of them, according to Francisco Valderrama, were actually US citizens, and we're talking of over 1 million people, right? Half of them. And then again in the 50s, Mexican immigrant criminality again led to record-breaking detentions and deportations, this time in Operation Wetback, when over 500,000 Mexican nationals were detained by the INS, who of course claimed a huge success for law enforcement. In short, treaties, legal status, historical precedents, contributions, none of these things have ever really mattered when it comes to Latinx belonging. And this was again put into evidence in the late 60s, when the disposability of Mexican Americans, whether as veterans of every war since the Civil War era, or as citizens, was made very manifest. They were tagged as foreigners in the society by the US government in 1969, when there was a bill pertaining to them, and it was lost for 4 months, and then finally, someone found it in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, because someone had assumed that Mexican-American affairs was a foreign problem. Any doubt that this isn't just a one-time anecdote was underscored less than a decade later, when defining all people of Mexican descent as a foreign problem was officially reinforced, this time by the Supreme Court. In 1975, it ruled in Immigrant Ponce that racial profiling was in fact allowable because, and I quote, "the likelihood that any given person of Mexican ancestry is an alien is high enough to make Mexican appearance a relevant factor." This is why SB 1070, the Shorten Your Papers laws, all of that are grounded in legal precedent in this country. It's not an invention of Arizona or any other state. And 2 years later, the Mexican-American experience began to be expunged for real. And this was together with the Puerto Rican experience, because both groups, along with all the other Latinx national origin groups, were suddenly subsumed under this label Hispanic, which was officially created, as I said before, in 1977 by the Office of Management and Budget. That label Hispanic has ultimately erased 150 years of the specificity of Mexican-American history, and not only of the people of Mexican descent, it also erased it from the national memory itself by erasing their membership in this national community. That is, their lawful and legal participation as citizens in the body politic. The new label also led to the expansion of the Immigrants Ponce Supreme Court, ruling on Mexican appearance to include all Hispanics. It's important to point out that over time, the recurring Mexican immigration to the US has forced Mexican immigrants to constantly have to fight for their right to have rights and belonging. And they did it partially by distancing themselves from Mexican immigrants, sometimes rejecting any relationship to Mexico and to the various waves of Mexican immigration last century. And David Gutierrez has really excellent work on this subject. But then came the 1960s and 70s and ethnic nationalism, and that led Chicanxes to redefine the boundaries of the US as a nation, and to realize through their social and civil rights movements that restricting immigrants' access and civil rights ultimately meant that they were restricting the rights of those who were in fact Chicanxes in the making, and it also undercut their own status. This newfound realization was ultimately short-lived, however, because the post-World War II civil rights struggles for inclusion had extended political and social citizenship not only to US citizens, but also to legal residents. So that by the 90s, as historian Dorothy Schneider has explained, and I quote, "there was little besides the right to vote that distinguished holders of US passports from those who held a green card." In response, the Clinton administration created immigration laws that were designed, in Linda Bosniak's words, to make national citizenship status either harder to obtain, more socially significant, or both. Basically, measures were devised and used to officially establish the boundaries of belonging, specifically through legislation, and largely by reaffirming immigrants' legality or illegality. The most blatant example of this was the IIRIRA, I don't know if you know the Clinton laws of 1996, but they were absolutely draconian. And this particular law, which stands for Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, in this law, when Clinton signed it, he said, it strengthened the rule of law, it cracked down on illegal immigration at the border, in the workplace, and in the criminal justice system, and it did it all without punishing those living in the United States legally. But in fact, it was exactly the opposite, because this law essentially invented immigrant enforcement as we know it today, particularly in relation to deportations, and which became a constant and very implausible threat to millions of immigrants, according to Dara Lind. So, what does this law do? It's 1996. I think it's really important for you to see the connections to today. This act severely punished US citizens. It had serious detrimental effects, most notably because it punished US citizens and non-citizens of all statuses. It eroded the rule of law by eliminating due process from the overwhelming majority of removal cases. It curtailed equitable relief from removal. It mandated detention without individualized custody determinations for broad swaths of those facing deportation. It erected insurmountable technical roadblocks to asylum. It also created new immigration-related crimes. It established the concept of criminal alienhood, which in the words of Abrego et al., has slowly but purposely conflated criminality and lack of immigration status. It also conditioned family reunification on income. It divided mixed status families. It consigned other families to marginal and insecure lives in the United States. Finally, it created the 287G program that enlists state and local law enforcement agencies in immigration enforcement, and it drives a wedge between police and immigrant communities. As a result, deportations actually skyrocketed from 70,000 in 1996 when he signed the law to 400,000 a year during Obama's tenure. It was signed into law together with another law called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty, and a third law called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. That last one I think is important for us to just stop on for a minute, because that's the one that stripped legal residents' rights to social services and restricted immigrants' access to public benefits. I have a friend of mine who was a green card holder for many years, a professor at a university who was going to lose his pension and lose his social security and lose everything after 30 years of teaching, and because of this law. And so he was forced to become a US citizen. But their rights, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because this Monday, on February 24th, the Trump administration has brought that back in a different form. It's called the Public Charge Rule, which actually was from the 19th century. And it says that if any non-citizen resident ever accessed any social or welfare services, they would no longer be eligible for citizenship. So that's starting on Monday. More broadly, one additional result of these 1996 Clinton laws, as Cecilia Menjivar and Lacey Abrego have argued, is that they contributed to create an axis of stratification and ultimately came to establish a social hierarchy anchored in legality as a social position for determining who has access to rights and social benefits. So basically, if you're legal, that means that socially you're located higher up in the social, and it seems these days increasingly in the human hierarchy, than people who are not legal. And it's true that by the end of the 90s, citizenship was used by the state to legally define and delimit the meaning of belonging and the distinction between US citizens and immigrants, regardless of status. And that was firmly entrenched, and the laws clearly located US citizens in opposition to undocumented Latinxes. Well, this was all very contradictory for Mexican Americans, because on the one hand, as citizens, they were being protected, right, and put against Mexican immigrants. But at the same time, they had to contend with the label Hispanic, which since the 80s have blurred their citizenship and all their history and presence. And so this blurring was contributing to further undermine their own citizenship as Mexican Americans. It was reinforcing the invisibility of their history. It was wiping out their historical presence in this country. It's important to remember that among the ravages of the 1980s and Reaganomics, there was also at the same time the rise of an all-out so-called war on drugs, with its hateful, racist rhetoric and its unforgiving drug policies and police killings, particularly of youth of color. There was also the invention of the 3 strike laws and the consequent rising number of long-term incarcerated African American and Latinx people, the effects of all of which we continue to witness today. So not surprisingly, by the 90s, as the society focused more and more on the rising number of Latin American immigrants, and particularly Mexicans, as a result of NAFTA being passed or implemented in '94, the label Hispanic took hold, and the media began to openly stoke fears of what Time magazine described in its 1990s cover story as the browning of America. By the end of the decade, the label Hispanic contributed to the perception and the redefinition of all people of Latin American descent as recently arrived laborers, as immigrants, and therefore foreigners. And this too undercut the recognition of Latinxes as actually eventual citizens or real citizens with equal rights. As for Mexican Americans, well, they became the Mexican members of the Latinx group. Gone was the specificity of Mexican Americans as historical minorities, and instead, all Mexicans were seen as foreigners and hence as illegals, turning Mexican Americans into permanent strangers in their own land. So who are strangers? They may be citizens, they may be foreigners or residents who have lived in the US for years, with or without any documents. They can be our neighbors who share an urban apartment building, or who live down the block or over there in the next farm, but rarely cross our path. But they're strangers. It's a term that is neither legally conceptualized or implied, but it's a term that, as opposed to foreigners or immigrants or citizens, nonetheless connotes otherness, and it's perceived as such, seen as the outsider, as the one who doesn't really belong by society. And so the term stranger also suggests that even if perhaps they do have a right to be here legally, as strangers, they're excluded from the community, they're denied belonging or home. Zygmunt Bauman explains this by saying this. He says, in the native worldview, the essence of the stranger is homelessness. Unlike an alien or a foreigner, the stranger isn't simply a newcomer, a person temporarily out of place. He's an eternal wanderer. He's homeless always and everywhere, without hope of ever arriving. As strangers, and somehow outsiders then, they threaten the insider-host's identity. They disturb the pre-existing social and cultural boundaries which the host takes for granted, as Pensich and Marotta have emphasized. Well, nowhere, in my view, is this idea more in evidence than in the aftermath not of the 2016 election, but in fact of the 2012 election. The aftermath of 2012 highlighted the boundaries of the nation's identity most clearly through conservative, mainstream opinion makers who sounded the alarms. And here's some of the things that they said. We're losing the American way of life. We've lost the country. This is because Obama got reelected, right? We've been outnumbered. Really? Okay. The white establishment is now a minority. Well, these kinds of statements clearly evoke this divisive binary of us versus them that Trump has since not just exploited, but actually been directly responding to from the first day back in June 16, 2015, when he attacked Mexicans and during the announcement of his candidacy. They also sounded the alarm about the existence of an enemy within, an other who's perceived to be destroying our country targeting our American way of life, and as such, undermining the very white identity of this nation. In fact, by 2012, the definition of the enemy was never really in question, nor was the nature of the fear. Because in the immediate aftermath of those presidential elections was notable, particularly because the mainstream media's overemphasis on the significance of the so-called Latinx vote in electing Obama. Even though in 2012, in fact, nothing had changed. Latinxes were actually still just part of that same original coalition of women and youth and African Americans, all 93% of the African Americans, that together had first elected Obama to the presidency. Okay, so I'm going to skip some more, and just tell you that the idea is that immigrants have to be made disposable. And this whole idea, one of the things that I argue also is that caging the stranger within now is that we don't know how many people are in, refugees are in cages today. We don't know how many children are in cages today. But we also don't know how many Latinx people are in cages in prisons, in federal prisons or state prisons or even local prisons today. And this is because for years, the US prison system has not counted Latinxes separate from whites, because since the African American population is so high, in order to bring the gap between the white prison population and the African American population down, so it was more equitable a little bit, they just threw all the Latinos in with the whites. And so we don't really know how many people, Latinx people, are in prison today. But the one thing we do know, according to Jose Luis Morin, is that the Latinx population in prisons is growing. The other two are not. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. Again, creation of caging the stranger within is not something that began with Trump. And I think it's very important to remember that Bush had this major, dramatic and inhumane raid called the Postville, Iowa raid in 2008. It was the largest, it was horrendous, freaked everybody in the country out. And then there's Obama, who became deporter-in-chief. I think it's important for us to remember that. So this is not a Trump thing. This goes all the way back to when the restrictionists and non-restrictionists agreed that Mexicans should not be citizens, okay? And then the last thing, I'm just going to summarize what I've tried to convey. First of all, however horrified people were when Trump came on the scene announcing that Mexicans are criminals and rapists and whatever else he said, there should be no doubt that the long history of attacks against Mexican Americans and the constant discounting of their presence and contributions, both insufficiently refuted over the years, is ultimately what also permitted the mainstream media and US society as a whole to allow those statements to burgeon into practical policies of discrimination. In other words, the collective shock expressed by the mainstream media when Trump came down was so horrific. It wasn't really about the actual substance or the content of Trump's attack on Mexicans, or even the attack itself against people of Mexican descent. The collective shock was more the fact that Trump actually voiced it in such unabashedly racist terms in 2015. So this is the story tale of how the growth of a neo-fascist rhetoric can deliver eventually the scarecrow of the enemy of the people by denying at first verbally the right to equality before the law of people of Mexican descent, casting them as immigrants, then foreigners, then undocumented, and ultimately illegal aliens, strangers, outsiders, irredeemable criminals, and more recently as invaders and congenital enemies of this country. No wonder that this careful, groomed mythology demands the restriction of any critical historical analysis of events. In fact, since Trump was elected, I keep having this vague thought that to be Mexican nowadays may resemble a little what it might have been like to be a Jew in 20th century Europe. It's a designation not of a concrete people, nor of a race or an ethnicity or religion, but rather of the unwanted stranger, the enemy within, regardless of his or her national origin. In this sense, Mexicans, regardless of their economic utility, are the bearers of a possible contagion for the national community of Americans. And I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Susana. Our next speaker is Professor Norman Buda. He's the Brahman Professor of Holocaust Studies and the Director of the Center for European Studies here at the University of Florida. He received his PhD in Modern European History from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has written or edited 9 books on Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, Cold War, and the history of Israel. He has served as a consultant to the US and German governments on the declassification of records related to Nazi war crimes, and has appeared in television and film documentaries in the US, France, Germany, and Israel. He is now working on a book concerning the trial of Klaus Barbie in Lyon in 1987. Thank you, Norman.
Technologically inept, so I appreciate that. Thank you, Carlos, for the kind introduction. Some time ago, early in the fall semester, Carlos and I were talking on a completely unrelated matter, and he asked me if I would take part in this program, tying, if I could, the images of Latino children separated from their parents at the US border to aspects, I think that's good, to aspects of the Holocaust and the years before the Holocaust, specifically Jewish refugees in the 1930s. And I said yes, because sadly, I'll just take the mic if you want me to take the mic. Thank you. And I said yes, I said yes, because sadly the images of refugees in detention was common throughout the 20th century, as is, and this is the point I want to make here, nationalism and racism dressed in the respectable garb of legal justification. In November 1938, Nazi Germany launched the Kristallnacht pogrom, which brought unprecedented violence against Jews throughout Germany, including beatings, rapes, and murders. It brought realization to German Jews that Nazi violence would not ameliorate and that their lives were in danger. German Jews who had not applied to emigrate now did so, causing a crush at foreign consular offices. The US had this immigration restriction, which you've all heard of, called the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which severely limited immigration based on a national quota system. The annual quota for Germany was relatively high at 25,000, but quotas in the 1930s were not filled. With the Great Depression, President Herbert Hoover implemented a strict reading of the criteria by which visa applicants were denied if they were, quote, likely to become a public charge. And this is, of course, something that goes back to the 19th century, which again, we're going to hear more about next week. That is to say, likely to become a public charge meant if they were likely to need public relief, which was a completely subjective standard. And on this basis, US consuls, then the gatekeepers of immigration, kept immigration well below quotas. President Roosevelt, I can talk loudly. Okay, it's kind of like, I shake it. So, President Roosevelt understood that most Americans in those days favored shrinking the quotas, not raising them, and so he did not challenge the Johnson Act. After 1936, though, he nibbled at the edges of the law, for instance, having consuls interpret the likely to become a public charge clause more liberally, so that by 1939 the quota was fully used. But in that year, 260,000 prospective Jewish immigrants from Germany were in the queue, which meant that, and there was an 11-year wait for visas. After Kristallnacht, German Jews with children did not feel that they could wait that long. Now, Great Britain understood the urgency. It allowed German Jewish children to come into the country so long as they were supported with private funds. And so from December 1938 until the outbreak of the war, some 10,000 Jewish children arrived in Britain. This was the so-called Kindertransport. In the US, and this is what I'm getting to, there was a bill sponsored by Democrat Robert Wagner of New York and Republican Representative Edith Rogers of Massachusetts that called for 20,000 Jewish children to be admitted over the next 2 years, over and above the quota. The bill carefully anticipated objections. It did not repeal or broaden the Johnson-Reed Act. The children had to be between 4 and 14. Each had to have private sponsorship before they could come to the US. US consuls reviewed each and every case as before. And when introducing the bill, Wagner noted that this was, quote, America's response to the call of humanity without any danger of the children becoming public charges or dislocating American industry or displacing American labor, unquote. 10,000 children per year for 2 years, he said, was an utterly insignificant proportion of our total population of 120 million in those days. This bill, the Wagner-Rogers bill, had backing from dozens of newspapers all over the US, major Catholic and Protestant organizations, and from unexpected quarters too, like the AFL-CIO, which tended to be restrictionist. The advocates for the bill also included Herbert Hoover, who had tightened the likely to become a public charge clause earlier, and Mrs. Calvin Coolidge, under whose husband the Johnson-Reed Act was passed. Hundreds of Americans had already offered their homes to refugee children. Journalist Dorothy Thompson described the bill as a no-brainer. I think she said that it is one of the most intelligent pieces of immigration legislation that has ever been proposed. The children came from middle-class families. They would be screened. They would have private support. They would not compete for jobs. They were young enough to learn English, and they would ameliorate the falling U.S. birth rate. But the test was in Congress. The bill was debated in 3 joint committee sessions in April of 1939. Gallup polls showed that 60% of Americans opposed this bill. Most of the organizations opposing were so-called patriotic societies. They included organizations like the Allied Patriotic Society, a conglomeration of some 30 groups, and something called the American Coalition, a similar organization with 2.5 million members. Their leaders appeared in Congress whenever the immigration issue came up. As Senator William King of Utah put it, these people always appear at these hearings, unquote. They also had sympathetic ears from a number of senators and congressmen. And what I want to do is sort of look at their rhetoric during these hearings because it displays an awful lot of the patterns heard today, from the need to uphold the law, to threaten national identity, to increase job competition, to welfare costs, to immigrant crime and subversion, to secret agendas aimed at tearing down borders and changing the United States and so forth. So, the sanctity of the law. Why, opponents ask, could the children not immigrate under the regular annual quota for Germany? This, after all, was in keeping with established law. And why was Germany being favored? Was the German quota under the law not large enough? It had not even been filled in past years. What about Jewish children in Poland? What about children who had fled the war in Spain? What about China? Children in China and Ethiopia. These were all disingenuous questions. No one really wanted quotas for Ethiopia or China. Some opponents of the bill actually came clean. If the Wagner Bill became law, said Herman Miller of the American Legion, and I quote, Congress will be morally obligated to pass a similar bill for the relief of children of Poland, the children of Romania, the children of Yugoslavia, the children of Spain, and in every other country in the world where a minority of people must flee, unquote. Charles Hall of the United American Mechanics put it thusly, quote, Spain, Russia, China, and Lord only knows how many other countries would have thousands of children for Uncle Sam to take care of, unquote. Fear of criminality was raised mostly through unrelated anecdotes. Howard Jarrett of the Patriotic Order of the Sons of America cited the case of one David Grobtuk, a dry cleaner in Germany who had lost his business, arrived in New York, and was soon arrested for pickpocketing. James Patton, another nativist, added that a certain H. Eli Goldsmith was selling fake immigration visas for Germany, Austria, and Poland, which was how, he said, a dangerous pickpocket like Grobtuk got into the country in the first place. You ought to do something about these refugee rackets, he insisted. Now, fake immigration visas were a scam. They got nobody into the country, and Grobtuk was a completely isolated incident of someone desperate, but there were more possibilities, supposedly, of crime. Suppose, asked Representative Charles Kramer of California, that one of these children, when he gets to be 17 or 18, might become very unruly and might have a police record. Well, one of them might, but this wasn't really the point. There was a wonderful disingenuousness when it came to the sanctity of the family. Francis Kinnicott, the president of the Allied Patriotic Societies, noted that, quote, all social agencies agree that children should not be separated from their parents, unquote. Howard Jarrett of the Sons of America warned that the bill would, quote, take children from their parents or nearest relatives where they should be. Mrs. Edward Hooling of the Allied Patriotic Societies lamented that, quote, it is a great hardship on children to separate them from their parents, unquote. Of course, it was not the law that was going to separate children from their parents, but rather the parents who wanted their children to travel to safety out of desperation. As Sidney Hollander of the National Council of Jewish Federations noted, there is no intention of breaking up families or withdrawing children from unwilling parents. Fathers and mothers at this moment in Germany are praying for their children to be sent abroad. Clarence Pickett of the American Friends Service Committee noted, too, that it is only in cases where families have been broken up or where parents plead to have the children come. Parents bring their children all the time to our offices. In almost every case, the parents say, can't you get the children out? This, of course, was the problem for nativists. They feared that the families would be reunited only in the US after the children had been used to breach the walls. There's this notion of an anchor baby, that will make it possible for the parents to become legal immigrants, is not necessarily new. Rabbi Stephen Wise testified that, quote, I have heard no sane person propose any departure from immigration laws now in force. Well, Rabbi Wise didn't talk to any of the insane people. Roscoe Walker of the United American Mechanics of New Jersey complained that the children were just the tip of the sword. I am quite sure, he predicted, that the old SOB system will again become operative and insist that these children have been separated from their parents and their families, and efforts will then be made to bring them all over. Margaret Hopkins Worrell, chair of the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic, worried of, quote, the great probability that sometime later the cry will be raised to unite these families, and we Americans will be assailed as heartless if we should oppose the entry of the fathers, the mothers, the sisters, the cousins, and the aunts. She had mentioned the uncles, but I'm sure she meant them too. John Thomas Taylor warned that, quote, if these children later become citizens of this country, they can bring in their parents, and the parents can bring in other children. So sanctity of the family was a very malleable thing. Even if no one came but the children, there was great worry. Representative Catherine O'Day of New York asked Hooling, what if the parents were dead and the children were orphans? Would Hooling then object? I would, answered Hooley, because I think it would be a serious danger to our country. John Trevor elaborated, this is 20,000 children producing 4 children each over 5 generations would produce 640,000 children. All of them would be subversives, of course, because Jews, even German Jews, whose parents were merchants and professionals and who were democratic politically, could simply not assimilate. As Agnes Water of the Mothers Movement put it, they can never be real Americans. Margaret Hopkins Worrell said that it was impossible to Americanize anyone over the age of 4. People countered this, but none of it mattered to those given to conspiracies. And the conspiracy of all of this is very interesting too to me. Howard Jarrett of the Patriotic Order of the Sons of America testified, quote, "I know the propaganda that has been well organized by anti-restrictionists to bring down existing inadequate immigration legislation. It emanates largely from New York City," unquote. James Patton of the Junior Order of United American Mechanics insisted that, quote, "the real object of this legislation is to break down the quota law of 1924 and open up our gates." Ida Piercy complained about, quote, "propaganda by highly paid propagandists all over the nation," unquote. Former Czech Foreign Minister Edward Beneš pointed out, quote, "has been speaking up in the northern colleges." Kennicott complained about, quote, "the tremendous pressure and lobby for this refugee legislation. The bill," he said, "was part of a program to admit to the United States refugees of all kinds of descriptions without regard to our present laws. It will be a precedent for similar unscientific legislation in response to the pressure of foreign nationalistic or racial groups, rather than in accordance with the needs and the desires of the American people." As the Cincinnati Times-Star said, "Wine and women are seeking admission of alien refugees," meaning that wine is served at dinner given congressmen by foreign lobbyists, and women are telegraphing that to refuse admission to refugees would be murderous, quote. And this conspiracy would be the end of American society. Agnes Waters of the Mothers Movement made it clear, "These children are seasoned veterans of a revolution of hate, are fertile fields for anarchy, and as such are potential leaders of a revolt against our American form of government." She continued, "If these so-called innocent, helpless children are admitted as refugees into America, I am sure they will become the leaders of a revolt and deprive my children of their right to worship God. We will all become slaves." Of course there were foster homes for all of them, Waters said, because, quote, "there is not a communist home that will not be glad to welcome a future comrade," unquote. "These children will come here with hatred in their hearts, and they will make potential enemies of our country and our children. These so-called innocent children, these so-called helpless refugees, already we have too many of their kind now trying to overthrow the government," unquote. But the most fascinating thing to come from these debates might have been the complete obliviousness to empirically researched facts. 2 arguments against the Wagner bill were common. One was that there were millions of poor American children waiting for adoption, and that even if they were not up for adoption, Jewish immigrants would exacerbate their ragged condition. The phrase "charity begins at home" was heard countless times as opponents discovered a sudden sympathy for children in city slums, in Appalachia, in the Dust Bowl, and in the sharecropping fields of the American South. Senator Robert Reynolds of North Carolina suddenly worried about the 8 million sons and daughters of American sharecroppers who lived, he said, in hovels, lacking basic education, and subsisted on biscuits and gravy. "Shall we first," asked John Cecil of the American Immigration Conference Board, "take care of our own children, or shall we bestow charity on children imported from abroad? If anyone has homes for refugee children," scolded Ida Piercy, "let them think of Americans. Charity begins at home. I think it is time for American people to show a little American blood and think of our own people." Quote. In fact, 20,000 Jewish children could be allowed in with no detriment to other children. It was empirically shown several times that there were more homes that wanted to adopt children than there were children to adopt. The argument that charity begins at home, said Michigan Congressman John Dingell, does not hold water. Our children are adopted into homes as rapidly as they can get them out of our public institution. The demand is much greater than the supply. No matter, immigration opponents continue to argue that the U.S. had a glut of American orphans. They also ignored that families all over the U.S. had offered in advance to house German Jewish children, and that the Jewish children would not, in other words, become public charges. Each child, the bill said, had to have an affidavit of private support before he or she could receive a visa. The affidavit had been a firm requirement and proof of private support for the past decade, no matter. Congressman Kramer of California now asked Clarice Pickett of the Friends Society, what do you mean by affidavits? What's that going to amount to? I've seen affidavits that have been changed and changed and rechanged. How do we know that the person who vouched for this is going to be in the same position a year or 5 years from now? Then there was the bugaboo of exacerbating unemployment. There were indeed over 10 million Americans unemployed, but the bill was specifically written to assuage fears that the children would compete for jobs. And the argument was also made repeatedly by newspapers and numerous witnesses that as 6- and 7-year-olds did not work anyway, they would be consumers who would help the economy rather than competition for existing jobs. Edith Rogers, the bill's co-sponsor, argued that the children would return to Germany at some point anyway because, quote, Hitler will not last forever. Even the AFL-CIO and the U.S. Department of Labor, all of which guarded the unemployment question closely, endorsed the bill. Joseph Padway, general counsel for the AFL, testified that the bill, quote, is not going to affect labor in the least. In no circumstances will this resolution affect the interests of labor, organized or not. Unquote. Regardless, Francis Kennicott insisted that, quote, these children will soon compete with American youth for jobs. William Griffith argued that they would become, quote, competitors for jobs in relief. Roscoe Walker said that they would compete for jobs when they were 19 years old, which was at least a decade away for most potential child immigrants. Senator Reynolds said the government should help 30,000 workers in the Works Progress Administration, a New Deal program, who he said were losing jobs every day. This figure was completely made up. And so it went. The bill ultimately never reached a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. I should add, though, that the US government did not let the German Jewish children into the country. Though they did not let them into the country, they did not separate children from their parents at US ports, partly because they just never made it that far. But the rhetoric is disturbingly similar. The anti-immigrant groups today have serious, policy-ish sounding names such as the Center for Immigration Studies and the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which the Southern Poverty Law Center describes as hate groups. They aim to repeal birthright citizenship, among other things. The appeals, meanwhile, are just eerily similar. As Attorney General Jeff Sessions put it in June 2018, quote, if you are smuggling a child, that child will be separated from you as required by law, unquote. The White House insisted that unaccompanied minors coming across the border were recruits for gangs such as MS-13. Fox News in August 2019 trumpeted the case of a man with several arrests claiming to be the father of a toddler who he carried to the border. GOP lawmakers called this child recycling. And then there's our president who uses the word invasion, as we just heard, repeatedly in rallies, advertisements, and on social media. I will do whatever is necessary to stop the invasion of our country. And as he said many times in 2019, Democrats want open borders, which equals violent crime, drugs, and human trafficking. Or as the reputable authority, radio talk show Mark Levine puts it, they all hate America. I will raise another way in which anti-Semitism and this particular racism are actually intertwined. Robert Bowers, who murdered 11 Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue last year, announced that his attack was provoked by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which helped Jewish refugees before World War II, and which he said was now helping the invasion of Latinos today. In other words, killing Jews in Pittsburgh, Bowers thought, would have a positive effect on the border 1,000 miles or so away. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Bowers said, likes to bring in invaders that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered, unquote. Indeed, the truth behind immigration restriction is always complex in certain minds, or it is just more simple. Just as it is easy today, thanks to the internet, to locate more openly racist comments aimed at children, it was also possible in 1939 to discern, if one looked, the less principled reason to oppose the Wagner-Rogers bill. As the socialite Laura Delano Hoebling, a cousin of President Roosevelt, put it privately, and I quote, 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow up to be 20,000 ugly adults. Thank you.
Thanks, Norman. The next speaker is Andreas Calibas. He teaches political theory in the Department of Politics at the New School in New York. He has been a visiting research professor at the University of Barcelona. He has also taught in Chile, Germany, Poland, and South Africa. He's the author of a key path-breaking book entitled Democracy and the Politics of the Extraordinary, which has fantastic analysis of Weber, Schmidt, and Hannah Arendt. And he's also the co-author of Liberal Beginnings, Making a Republic for the Mothers, both books published by Cambridge. He has co-edited with Polity Press 2 books by Carl Schmitt, and he's currently completing a book manuscript entitled Tyranny Legalized, Republicanism, Dictatorship, and the Enemy Within.
Thank you, Carlos, for this invitation. It's a very important topic to discuss, the issue of the detention camps, separation of families, and in general, the dehumanization of what I call the migrant. But as Susan said, it describes one of the most central political problems of our times. But also I will need to apologize because what I will present today does not directly address this issue or does not address it in the way that maybe it should. It is not that I believe dehumanization is not an important topic or that the task of protecting vulnerable population is not a worthy task. Far from it, but I do believe that dehumanization and criminalization of migrants, when treated in isolation or understood solely as a moral or legal problem, tends to ignore some other important aspects associated with migration, and specifically with irregular migration, which is the main topic of what I will say today. So I want to emphasize, to draw attention to 3 essential aspects of irregular migration that are often overlooked in the voluminous scholarship and the general discussions about refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons. So there might be some additional aspects as well, but it is my understanding that these 3 dimensions are constitutive of what we understand or we discuss as irregular migration. And I will say a bit why I use that term later on. So there is first the dimension of class composition that is constitutive of irregular migration. From a purely descriptive point of view, the overwhelming majority of irregular migrants are workers. Of course, there are these divisions along gender, ethnicity, regional and local differences, but what unites the broader majority, the wider majority of irregular migrants is their class content. That is, workers, usually poor workers, in search of work. In that sense, I take the class composition of irregular migration to overdetermine that phenomenon. In this sense, there is a concrete, material, socioeconomic content that defines the class character of irregular migrants and the reform of migration in that sense. And most of the time, this class content is concealed under an abstract formalism characteristic of individual assumptions that inform the language of universal human rights, and also of some moralistic discourses that address the question of irregular migration. So, if one chooses to speak of the maybe the other one. So if, let's say, one chooses to speak of the dehumanization and the criminalization of refugees and migrants, one has to specify and to be aware that this is a dehumanization of the working class, of the poor, or more specifically, of the mobile section of the working class, let's say the nomadic proletariat, that looks for work in a broader world market economy. It is a dehumanization and racialization directed against a well-defined socioeconomic group. And this sometimes something that we tend to forget by abstracting and universalizing the category of migration, of refugees, of asylum workers. So here what we have, seekers, what we have is what we can call class racism. And if one also adds to this aspect of irregular migration that the majority of these workers are coming from the global south, then we have the racialization of the working class of the global south as the specific content of that development. So, in addition to this class dimension of irregular migration, there is also a political aspect that we need to pay attention to. I'm referring here to the emerging politicization of irregular migrants, manifested and expressed in their various and diverse political mobilizations, collective self-organizing, and acts of public contestation. It is this political dimension which Hannah Arendt's seminal work on statelessness and Georgia Campbell's radicalization of that work in terms of the figure of the Homo sapiens have unfortunately contributed in obscuring. And that I want to emphasize and to make intelligible, drawing attention to its multiple significance and meanings. So in other words, instead of looking at the dehumanization, criminalization of the irregular migrants, I think it's also important to look at the forms of political self-subjectification, the way they become political actors in their own difficult social and economic conditions. So to shift the attention from the victimization of the irregular migrants to forms of empowerment. Finally, these two aspects of irregular migration, class composition and politicization,
probably I lost the page of the third element, but no, it's red.
Oh, it's red,
Yes.
it's finished.
Red means finishing.
Se acaba la
Yes.
the battery. Okay.
So, the third aspect, if we combine the elements of class composition and politicization of irregular migration, is the horizons of possibility they open up for rethinking and renewing the project of internationalism as it was conceived from the end of the 19th century up to the 20th century. In other words, the class dimension and political activation of the struggles of irregular migrants might open ways of rethinking international forms of labor organization and new levels, new stages for the emancipation of labor at the time of globalized capital. So before I return to address a bit in more detail these three aspects, I want to introduce some conceptual clarifications regarding irregular migration and the stateless person, which might be useful for the discussion. So by irregular migration, I refer to a specific form of territorial mobility and border crossing, as well as a particular condition of residing in a state that departs from formal norms and legal regulations as they are unauthorized and unsanctioned by existing administrative and normative orders. Simply put, irregular migration, which is not by itself a legal category, but predominantly a descriptive sociological concept, designates a movement of persons that is situated and takes place outside the laws, regulations, or international agreements governing entry and exit. Hence, irregular migrants are persons moving outside regular migration processes and channels. So this sometimes by law it's described as illegal migration, but the term irregular, I think it's more correct in understanding the procedural informalities of that type of movement. Also, it is important to note that this condition of externality to the laws of mobility generates and produces statelessness. That is, a de jure and de facto deprivation of nationality and citizenship. Statelessness, contrary to the concept of irregular migration, it is a legal concept. It's a legal concept since the two international conventions on statelessness. And the distinction between de jure and de facto deprivation of nationality and citizenship is extremely important because already it points at contemporary developments with migration. Statelessness is a defining attribute of irregular migration, both as its cause and as its effect. More and more, the irregular migrant is a stateless person, as the two figures merge into one broader single category, that of the stateless migrant, who can be described as someone who moves across borders irregularly and informally outside the operations of domestic and international law. That is someone who moves clandestinely in space and across territories. Now, the category of the stateless person usually has been associated with refugees. But because of de facto statelessness, more and more this category now is populated by what we call economic migrants, whether by necessity or by choice, do not appeal and refer to their nationality or to their state for protection, precisely in order not to be deported. So these are the two dominant concepts that I'm using, the irregular migrant as a stateless person. Now, I want to go back now to the three main aspects or dimensions of contemporary irregular migration. The first is the class composition, which means that if we shift attention from the individualistic, abstract characteristic of the refugee, of the asylum seeker, of the economic migrant to its class dimension, we introduce a material understanding of this important phenomenon of irregular migration. We also highlight the socioeconomic aspects in relation to a global economy and to a world market, and also a politico-economic aspect in relation to the international division of labor. So I'm going to mention, to quote from an unlikely source in debates about migration, and probably for most of you a quite unpleasant name, Lenin, who wrote in 1913 a very short but extremely important essay on capitalism and migration, 1913. And in the second paragraph, in the first paragraph, he states, capitalism has given rise to a special form of migration of nations. The rapidly developing industrial countries raise wages at home above the average rate and thus attract workers from the backward countries. There is no doubt that dire poverty compels people to abandon their native land and that the capitalists exploit the immigrant workers in the most shameless manner. So in this short piece, Lenin tries to understand the political importance of migration. One, it is understood within the broader global division between labor and capital, but at the world economy, and not anymore from a national or local or even regional point of view. So he introduces the idea that the exploitation, the driving force of migration has to do with the globalization of capital, imperial colonialism, and the particular struggles among different sectors of the working class. But what is more important is that at the end of this article, he makes the following claim. Only reactionaries can shut their eyes to the progressive significance of this modern migration of nations. So although it is an exploitative and oppressive phenomenon, he argued that it has a progressive significance. In other words, he didn't emphasize only the negative dimensions of migration, the repression, domination, and exploitation that irregular migrants are suffering, but he tried dialectically to elucidate also the positive and emancipatory aspects. And this is what I think also we should keep an open eye in order to avoid reducing the phenomena that we are witnessing today as purely negative and reactionary, but to search for the positive kernel in those unhappy times. So Lenin continues. The bourgeoisie incites the workers of one nation against those of another in the endeavor to keep them disunited. This is what nationalism most of the time does, and this is what we witness today in relation to the radicalization of the right, especially when it faces questions of migration, membership, belonging. And he continues. Class-conscious workers, realizing that the breakdown of all national barriers by capitalism is inevitable and progressive, are trying to help to enlighten and organize their fellow workers from the backward countries. And here is the traditional but powerful idea of international solidarity among the working class. Something that today is missing, and something that might explain again the rise of the radicalized right that has been successfully divided the global working class along national and racial lines. So the second aspect, before concluding with the internationalist promises of our present situation, has to do with politicization. Again, the general emphasis on studies and discussions about irregular migrants is to look at their victimizations, at the way they are oppressed, repressed, and exploited. That it is a legitimate and meaningful point of view, but in my understanding is also quite limited. What I mean by politicization of the irregular migrant? Revolts in detention centers around the globe, massive public demonstrations, strikes in labor places where irregular migrants work, riots, sit-ins, occupation, squats, hunger strikes, organizations and associations by irregular migrants, publications, pamphlets, manifestos, artworks, and more recently, border confrontations and clashes with the border patrols. This is a completely new phenomenon where irregular migrants, this has happened in the United States, and it has happened in Europe, when irregular migrants confront border patrol on the side of borders, that is, they politicize the borders from below. Usually confrontations around borders or on borders happen between organized armies. To have that kind of public mobilization on borders shows a great potential of new political struggles, where mobility itself becomes politicized. This and other activities I didn't mention are clearly political, and are initiated by irregular migrants themselves. And from the point of view of both domestic and international law, they don't make sense, they cannot be really theorized. For the simple reason that domestic and international law does not recognize political rights for irregular migrants. They might be the subject of human rights, but they are not the subject of political rights. So, in order to come to terms, to interpret the significance of this form of political self-activation from below by those that we tend to consider as the most vulnerable subjects in a globalized world, those that need protection because they have lost the protection of their own state, we will need to shift our conceptual categories. In other words, we need to understand the politicization of the irregular migrant as the other side of their dehumanization. It is the inverse image that operates in a paradoxical relationship, dialectical but still paradoxical, between politicization and dehumanization. In other words, if someone is dehumanized, does mean that one loses one's political identity or political possibilities. As states seek to dehumanize the nomadic proletariat, they are also facing its constant resistance, its struggles in everyday life, that is, its transformation into a political subject. And here we have new forms of public spaces, the formation of new political identities, and the emergence of new political discourses about what constitutes citizenship, what constitutes a right, and what constitutes democracy in the end. So the main question is how to make intelligible these phenomena, instead of understanding them as irrational, disorganized explosions of the excluded, of the disempowered. We will have probably to understand them as expressions of a redeeming emancipatory possibility of the future. So, if law is not properly adequate to understand these political activities, because it does not recognize anything beyond besides the name of right. So if something is not a legal right, something simply is not for the law. These activities and initiatives have to be interpreted and examined from a different perspective, the perspective of political subjectivity. And here I would like to mention a radical rethinking of what we mean by citizenship. And this is what I have tried to formulate as stateless citizen or stateless citizenship. Always in modern times, citizenship is understood as a formal, legal, juridical category associated with positive privileges, protections, and rights. However, citizenship in its longer history, before the emergence of the modern state, was understood predominantly as an activity, not as a formal right, not as a juridical norm. And as a political activity that comes from the tradition of classical democracy and classical republicanism, it meant something extremely simple, but also intensively political. To be a citizen, it was theorized, was to take sides in a political conflict. This is what has been understood as the Solonian theory of citizenship, because it appears in one of Solon's reforms in late archaic times. So Solon made a law according to which a citizen is someone who participates in a political conflict at the moment when a city finds itself in a civic strife. So underneath the legal dimension of citizenship lies a deeply substantive political experience. Someone becomes a citizen when someone takes a side in a public conflict. And from that perspective, the politicization and the intensification of political struggles by irregular migrants themselves, who are not recognized as political subjects, is deeply expressive of citizenship for the simple reason that they take a side about the very important public issues and political matters. Questions of belonging, as we discussed, issues of membership, discussions about exclusion and inclusion, but also more concrete issues about labor rights, conditions of housing, dimensions of racialization. So on all these matters, forms of mobilization and contestation initiated by migrants is extremely political. So this is a form of citizenship that lacks the juridical dimension of what we mean a citizen, but redeems its political content. And here we are facing sometimes a paradoxical situation once we take these forms of mobilization seriously. It will seem that those who are truly citizens are those who are not supposed to be citizens, and those who are formally citizens, usually participate only by voting, are not really political citizens. So the paradox that it gives rise, the politicization of irregular migration, is that it questions the citizenship of those who have it but don't really exercise it, and emphasizes the citizenship of those who don't have it but do exercise it. So, just to conclude, maybe I should mention Lenin once more,
Just to provoke the audience.
Never too much Lenin.
actually, how can we fear a dead man? It's too late to be afraid of Lenin. So, I will read from a text he wrote, he delivered 20 days before the October Revolution, on the 6th of October of 1917, in a debate of the Bolshevik Party regarding imperialism and colonialism. So the debate about the position of the Bolshevik Party in relation to these two issues, and Lenin becomes critical of some of his comrades for the following reason, for not mentioning migration and migrants. And he says, the exploitation of worst paid labor from backward countries is particularly characteristic of imperialism. On this exploitation rests, to a certain degree, the parasitism of rich imperialist countries which bribe a part of their workers with higher wages while shamelessly and unrestrainedly exploiting the labor of cheap foreign workers. The world's worst paid should be added, is also the world's and frequently the one whose rights are deprived. So he adds, for the exploiters in civilized countries always take advantage of the fact that the imported foreign workers have no rights. So he established a connection that will become more famous with Hannah Arendt, but Arendt takes out the class composition, that the exploitation of migrant labor coincides also with the deprivation of rights. But instead of lamenting about the situation, he considered it to be not only heuristically very important to understand the global imperial and colonial structuring of the world order, but most importantly to be the beginning of a new revolutionary historical moment. So in these new conditions, let's say from a post-Leninist perspective, the presence of irregular migrants and their multiform struggles renders internationalism more than ever an urgent task, an obligation for those who want to fight for the emancipated labor.
And it becomes the very condition for the liberation of labor from detention centers, exploitative working conditions, social exclusion, and its racialization and dehumanization. It is a very and unusually difficult task that faces incredible obstacles. No one should idealize or romanticize the political self-activities of the irregular migrants, but on the other hand, we cannot also ignore it, because that will be to reproduce the logic of the state. To see the irregular migrant as the state wants us to see, as pure victims, pure criminals, pure subhumans. The act of self-organizing and the self-political subjectification of irregular migrants, what we can call microsystems of struggles in all forms of, in many sectors of social life, is the most concrete examples of the possibility for a new international and a new internationalism, what we might call the Fifth International, and the new stages in the global struggles of labor today. So I will end in this positive note for a subject that is mainly a sad subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Since obtaining his doctoral degree in 1999, Dr. De La Torre has authored over 100 articles and published 36 books, 5 of which won national awards. He presently serves as professor of social ethics in Latinx studies at Ilfil School of Theology in Denver. A Fulbright scholar, he has taught in Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, Great Britain, and Germany. He served as the 2012 president of the Society of Christian Ethics. Additionally, he was the co-founder and executive director of the Society of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion, the founding editor of the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion. Recently, he wrote a screenplay to a documentary on immigration entitled Tales of Hope and Terror, which has screened in over 18 film festivals, winning over 7 national and international awards.
Buenas tardes. African-American liberation theologian James Cone said that all white Christianity is satanic. Any religion that ignores the genocide of Indians and the enslavement of blacks is from the pit of hell. I would add to that any religion that tears children from their mothers, whether it be back in the days of slavery, or the Indian mothers so the kids could go to Indian schools, or brown children today at our border, is satanic. And I say this because all white moral reasoning is deadly and life-denying to people of color. Building on James Cone, I would argue that all enlightened, Eurocentric, philosophical thought and movement is killing us. You see, when the French cried out, liberté, égalité, fraternité, they never intended to include the colonized people in Algiers, Vietnam, or Haiti. It was only meant for white French people. So basically, every time I listen to Eurocentric thought, I have to do a code switching to understand what they really mean. There's a lot of good church folk who look at the immigration crisis, good liberals, and they say things like, we have to practice the virtue of hospitality and take in these people and show them hospitality. But you see, what hospitality ignores is centuries of gunboat diplomacy that have stole the raw material and the cheap labor of Latin America. The reason I am an immigrant in this country is because this country entered my country and stole my rum, my sugar, and my tobacco, the 3 essentials of life. When one nation builds roads into another nation to steal their raw material and cheap labor, why should we be surprised that those people take those same roads following everything that has been stolen from them? So basically, it is my raw material and my cheap labors that built this house. So to say hospitality assumes that the dominant white culture owns the house that we built. So I don't want your hospitality, I want my damn house back. But before I begin to confront a white Eurocentric culture for its complicity with white supremacy that's creating this racial crisis, I have to confront how my own mind has been colonized. And I'll give you an example. I remember once I was driving from Miami, where I used to live, to New York City when I was a young teenager, my hair down to here, windows rolled down, listening to a gran combo. And as I was driving north, I was going through New Jersey, and I was stopped by the police because I was going 5 miles above the speed limit. And then the officer said, "Can I search your vehicle?" To which I said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." So I asked, what was he looking for? And he says, "Well, young Latino men with Dade County license plates are usually trafficking coke from Miami to New York." He didn't find any. So, he still gave me a ticket, but here's the thing. As I was driving away, what went through my mind was not the indignation of racial profiling. What went through my mind was, thank God the cops are doing their job in keeping our streets safe. You see, my mind was so colonized that I was seeing myself through the eyes of my oppressors. And the problem becomes when I use the philosophy and the theology of my oppressors as a means by which to find my liberation. My intellectual mentor, Jose Martí, once says, "El vino de plátano, si sale agrio, sigue siendo nuestro vino." Now, for those of you who have yet learned the language of the angels, let me translate for you. "We shall make our wines out of plantains, and even if it comes out sour, it is still our wine." And see, what he was saying is, it doesn't matter if we get it wrong. It's made from our own cultural symbols, and therefore, it is better than the wine that is being imposed upon us by those who wish to steal our raw material and our cheap labor. So keeping Jose Martí in mind, my job as an ethicist was trying to figure out how do I create a moral reasoning apart from the Eurocentric way of doing moral reasoning that uses the symbols of my culture. And I begin by embracing hopelessness and dissing hope. Hope, for those of you who are Christian, is foundational to the faith. And yet I am saying that hope is what domesticates our people. I'll never forget, I took a group of students to Cuernavaca, Mexico, to learn how our riches in this country is literally connected to the poverty in the shanty towns of Cuernavaca, to study how neoliberalism worked. And that evening, as I was unpacking with my students, one of them said, "Well, you know, these poor children, it's so horrible seeing them live in this condition. But I saw the hope in the eyes of the little girls." At which point I had an epistemological meltdown, because what I told her was, "I'm not sure what you saw in her eyes, but in about another 5, 6 years, she's going to be turning tricks to put food on the table or be trapped in an abusive marriage. Because for her, there is no hope. Neoliberalism has choked all hope out of her. She will live in poverty as her children and her grandchildren will." And yes, we can maybe lift up one that made it out, For the vast majority of the population, there is no hope. But we sell hope because for this student, as long as there was hope, she didn't have to do anything. God will take care of everything. God is good. Everything will be okay for this little girl. And what I'm trying to say is, no, it's not. When I visited Auschwitz, there's a sign at the gate entrance, which I know you are aware of, that says, work will set you free. And we know that's not true. But you see, if I can believe that maybe I could survive, I will not be disruptive. I will go ahead and keep my head down. I won't make waves. Maybe I will survive. But what I am arguing is, if we want to change society, we have to embrace the hopelessness, because once I have nothing to lose, that's when I become the most dangerous. And because I do have something to lose, I remain silent and complicit as children are thrown into cages. And as every 4 days that go by, 5 brown bodies perish on our borders. You see, we have created an ethical system that for me, if I want to do a protest, I have to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality. We have domesticated protest. We have domesticated the way we rebel. So that we could, this is the only country where you can drive to a march. Think about that. In other words, I could go and march and feel good about myself, and yet nothing changes. I teach at one of the most radical leftist theological schools in the country. And every so often, my white students come to me and say, "Oh, Dr. De La Torre, let's go get arrested." And I'm like, I'm a Latino man. I don't have to go try to get arrested. It comes natural for us. And besides, me in jail is a lot worse than you white kids. You go get arrested. You know, you earn your liberal badge of courage because it makes you feel good about yourself. But it doesn't change the social structures that are creating these oppressive things. So, what do we do? When I was in Mexico, I was speaking to a Chiapa rebel, and he said something that really stayed with me. He said that he was losing his land, so he went over to the government to protest and to argue that. And the government looked at him and said, "You smelly Indian, get out of here." He said, "I showed up the next day with a bandana and AK-47. You know what? They listened to me. We were able to have a conversation." And I began to realize that following the rules won't change anything. But at the same time, breaking the rules could get me killed. So how do the oppressed of the world attempt change without dying in the process? Doesn't always work. And what what I'm about to say, I did not invent. I've literally learned it from activists for whom I have been with, as a organic intellectual, if you want to quote Kristallnacht. What I am calling this an ethics para joder. Now, for those of you who do not know Spanish, joder is a certain word you never use in polite conversation. Similar to a certain 4-letter word that begins with F and ends with K. And I am saying that we need to develop an ethics that screws with the power structures. It is a trickster type ethics, and every culture has it. African Americans have bear rabbit and bear. Native Americans have coyote and spider. Being Cuban, I'm a child of El Eguá. And for those of you who know anything about Santeria, El Eguá is the trickster of our tradition. So people who are oppressed have learned how to be tricksters, how to use hidden transcripts to say things and do things, to hold those who are into the rhetoric of liberty accountable to what they say. So let me give you an example of how I developed this ethics para joder. Back in the late 60s, there was a gang in New York known as the Young Lords. And they were also in Chicago. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm more familiar with the New York brand. And the Young Lords were a tough gang, but then they got radicalized when they were in prison. And they began to do some fantastic stuff. So the Young Lords, mostly Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, they went ahead and in the byways of New York, they cleaned up the streets, they put all the garbage in bags, they put it on the street corners, and then they called the sanitation department to come pick up the garbage. But see, the sanitation department only showed up whenever they felt like showing up in the neighborhoods of color. So they took those bags, and they went to 3rd Avenue, and they built a 3-foot wall, and they set it on fire during rush hour traffic. Now, what this did, this is what I call jodiendo. What they did was they stopped traffic, newspapers came out, they took pictures, they got beaten up, thrown in jail. But you see, the New York Times started doing articles about the sanitation department. And now they pick up garbage on Tuesdays and Fridays in the neighborhood. See, by jodiendo, you hold the institution accountable to their mission. But not just the government, the church as well. Another thing that they did, they went to the Primera Iglesia Metodista in Spanish Harlem. And they went to the pastor and they said, you know, Pastor, we like to have breakfast for our children when they go to school. We want to have a clothes drive. We want some attorneys here to help people with immigration issues. And the pastor looked at them and said, you bunch of commies, get out of here. So they showed up the next Sunday. They picked up the pastor, they threw him out, and they nailed a sign on the door called the People's Church. And for about 3 weeks, they did all the things that the church is supposed to be doing until the cops came and threw him out. So the methodology of this ethics para joder is to hold those in power accountable to their own rhetoric in a way that tries not to get you killed in the process or arrested. So how does this apply to immigration? So I work a lot with some of the groups down on the border, and I developed this ethics para joder while on the border working with them and sharing with them some of my thoughts. So that's one of the things that they did after I made these presentations to them. You're all familiar with Operation Streamline. That's the process in where basically if you get picked up as an undocumented immigrant, within 24 hours you're before a judge that hears your case and sentence you in about less than 10 seconds because you're doing like a whole group of you at the same time. And then you put in prison, a private prison, so that the prison can make money off the government. And then you're deported with a record so that you can never apply for citizenship again. So there's a kangaroo court that we have set up to deny justice to immigrants. So what they did in the district court in Tucson is that a bunch of ministers showed up during these hearings to stand in solidarity with migrants who were being tried. And then during the court proceeding, a Jewish rabbi stands up and starts asking for Yahweh for forgiveness for what we're about to do. Yahweh Hashem, I'm sorry. Asking Hashem for forgiveness for what we're about to do. And then later, of course, the bailiff takes him out, and then an imam stands up and starts asking for Allah for forgiveness as a nation for what we're doing. And he's taken out, and the Catholic priest stands up and starts asking Jesus for forgiveness. And it literally stopped the procedures for that day, and got a lot of press out of it. This is jodiendo. This is using the symbols of clergy, in my case, as a way of holding the government responsible for saying that they're supposed to be a Christian nation but doing everything against the very tenets of Christianity. Another thing that they did is when you bring the prisoners for the kangaroo court, they come in buses from Eloy, which is where they're detained. So a car got in front of one of the buses and then stopped. So the bus had to stop, and when they did, a bunch of people came out and tied themselves with dragon sleeves around the wheels. And dragon sleeves are these long tubes that you put on your arm, and you fill them with rocks and all kinds of stuff that you can't saw them off. And they locked themselves with locks, and literally none of those immigrants went to court that day. Now, true, they ended up going the next day, and they got deported anyway. But the point is, how do you use media in a way by Jodiendo that calls attention to the cause? And the thing is, it really is an attempt to move away from this domesticated, polite, private way of demonstrating against our people getting killed. So, I am a social ethicist. That's what I do as a scholar. And I am trying to figure out, how do I lie ethically so I could find out what is true? How do I ethically steal so people can eat? How do I joke and disrupt and deceive so that justice could occur? And this definitely moves away from this whole Eurocentric idea of right and wrong, true and lie, and lives in that ambiguous space in where the vast majority of the world of press find themselves. Gracias.